31,000 years ago, in a Borneo cave, someone cut off a child's leg, and the child lived. Not for a day, for 6 to 9 years, with no antibiotics, no metal tools, no germ theory. In 2022, scientists found the skeleton. The person was 20 at death. They survived that amputation for a decade. Before this, we thought the oldest surgery was 7,000 years old. This find is older by 24,000 years. So how sophisticated were they, really? Let's go.
Here's the thing nobody talks about enough. When most people picture ancient medicine, they picture something between a nature documentary and a fantasy novel. Herbs, shamans, maybe some honey smeared on a wound, someone chanting while holding a bundle of leaves. And if we're being generous, we maybe allow them some practical knowledge, pressure on a bleeding wound, splints for broken bones, the basic stuff that even a moderately observant chimpanzee could figure out. But surgery? Actual cutting? Removing limbs? Drilling into skulls? We file that under civilization. We assume it arrived with farming, with cities, with written language, with the accumulated knowledge of settled societies that had time to specialize. The timeline we carry in our heads goes something like foragers survived on luck and toughness, then farmers invented medicine, then Egyptians built pyramids and maybe did some mummification, then the Greeks showed up and things got scientific. Except the Borneo amputation proves that timeline is garbage. Complex surgery didn't arrive with agriculture. It predates agriculture by an almost embarrassing margin. Whoever performed that operation in that cave had to understand human anatomy well enough to avoid killing the patient on the table. They needed detailed knowledge of blood vessels, nerves, and muscle structure to cut cleanly without causing fatal bleeding or infection. This is a level of surgical sophistication that nobody expected from a hunter-gatherer society, because it had long been assumed that foraging peoples had only rudimentary medical knowledge. They were wrong, and once you notice that, the whole tidy narrative starts to unravel.
Let's think about what actually had to happen in that cave. 31,000 years ago, before pottery, before domesticated dogs, before anyone had thought to plant a seed and wait for it to grow, a human being, someone who spent most of their time finding food, making tools, and avoiding predators, looked at a severely injured or diseased leg and decided the only way to save the person was to remove it. That decision alone requires a staggering amount of knowledge. You have to know that cutting off a limb can save a life. You have to know where to cut. You have to know how to control bleeding without modern clamps or cauterization. You have to know that keep the wound clean enough that infection doesn't set in immediately. And you have to know that the person on the ground won't bleed out before you finish. And then, the part we almost never think about, you have to know how to care for that person afterward, because the skeleton shows 6 to 9 years of healing. 6 to 9 years of someone bringing food to a person who couldn't hunt. 6 to 9 years of keeping a wound clean in a rainforest. 6 to 9 years of social support for someone who was, by the standards of that world, disabled. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't one brilliant individual working in isolation. This was a community that had developed, refined, and passed down surgical knowledge sophisticated enough to rival procedures we associate with the modern era. The patient didn't just survive the operation, they survived the recovery, in a world without hospitals. Let that sit for a moment. A foraging society in a Borneo cave performed successful limb amputation 24,000 years before the previous record holder, a Neolithic farmer in France who lost his forearm. We thought 7,000 years was the beginning. We were off by an entire ice age.
But if you think cutting off legs is where this story peaks, I need to tell you about the skulls.
Because ancient humans weren't just removing limbs, they were cutting into heads. And they were doing it so often and so successfully that the archaeological record is littered with proof. Trepanation, cutting or drilling an opening into the skull. It shows up in more than 1,500 documented Neolithic skulls worldwide. And here's the detail that changes everything. Many of them show clear bone regrowth around the opening, direct physical proof that the patient lived for months or years afterward. This wasn't some desperate last resort procedure that always killed people. This was medicine. It worked often enough to leave a fossil record of survival. Bioarchaeologist Danielle Curran, who studied trepan skulls in Peru dating back over 1,000 years, found clear evidence of successful healing at surgery sites. And she drew a direct comparison to how battlefield trauma has historically driven medical innovation. She compared ancient Andean trepanation to how Civil War gunshot wounds advanced glass eye prosthetics, and how modern IED injuries are advancing today's prosthetics research. And here's the part that doesn't flatter the 1860s. Ancient Peruvian surgeons were succeeding repeatedly, systematically, at opening skulls and keeping patients alive, while Civil War doctors were still arguing about whether washing your hands between patients was worth the trouble. The ancient world doesn't always look primitive when you hold it up against more recent history. Sometimes it looks like it had already figured out things we forgot. But trepanation wasn't just a human story. At a site in France, researchers found a 5,200-year-old cow skull with a hole that was originally assumed to be from another cow's horn. Reanalysis confirmed the marks matched deliberate trepanation. Researchers believe this may represent the world's first known attempt at veterinary surgery. Or, and this is somehow even more fascinating, that Neolithic surgeons practiced their skull-cutting technique on animals before ever performing it on a human patient. Think about what that implies. A surgeon so dedicated to getting it right that they rehearsed on a cow. A community that valued the procedure enough to risk livestock for the practice. A medical tradition with enough structure to include training. This detail almost never appears in human-focused history content, which is a shame because it might be the most human detail in the entire story. We didn't just cut into our own heads, we practiced first. We were careful. We were trying to get better at keeping each other alive.
So here's where the tidy narrative completely falls apart. Because if you ask the average person which ancient civilizations were cutting into skulls, they'll say Egypt. They'll say Rome. Pop culture has spent decades linking ancient Egypt to skull drilling, to mummies with mysterious medical knowledge, to hieroglyphs that probably encode lost surgical secrets. Actually, it is. It's exactly as wrong as it sounds. Paleopathology studies show trepanation was almost never practiced in ancient Egypt, despite the movies, despite the assumptions, despite the entire aesthetic of mysterious pyramid medicine. The Egyptians basically didn't do it. Similarly, very few trepan skulls have ever been found from Imperial Rome. The Romans favored cremation and reserved surgery only for cases where more conservative treatment had already failed. They were, by the standards of their own time, surprisingly cautious about cutting into skulls. This inverts what most people assume about which ancient civilizations were the surgical ones. We picture Rome with its aqueducts and its engineering and assume they were also cutting heads open. We picture Egypt with its mummies and assume they must have drilled skulls. Nope. The real surgical innovators were foragers in Borneo, nomads in the Andes, and communities across prehistoric Europe and Asia who were doing things that great empires wouldn't touch. And then there's China. There's a widespread assumption that ancient Chinese medicine relied entirely on non-surgical, herbal treatment, acupuncture and ginseng and elaborate teas, the gentle East versus the knife-happy West.
but a significant number of trypan skulls have been unearthed across China, showing clear signs of healing. Patients survived brain surgery in ancient China. Direct physical evidence sitting in archaeological collections proving that Chinese medicine had a surgical tradition that directly complicates the standard East used herbs, West used the knife narrative that most content repeats uncritically. So the civilizations we think of as medical were conservative, and the civilizations we think of as primitive were cutting into skulls with a success rate that should embarrass 19th century battlefield hospitals. Once you notice that, the whole framework starts to look like we were projecting our own assumptions onto the past and calling it history.
But we need to be honest about something. Not every ancient surgery was a success story, and the failures tell us just as much as the victories, maybe more. At a Bronze Age site called Megiddo, researchers found a young man who had undergone a rare, specific type of cranial surgery called angular notched trephination. Unlike most trephination cases, there was no evidence of bone healing at all. He died during the procedure or shortly after. The wound never had time to remodel. He was a surgical fatality. But here's what makes his death genuinely haunting. Researchers believe his higher social status is what gave him access to this unusual and high-level intervention in the first place. Surgery wasn't universally available. It was a form of ancient medical privilege. If you were wealthy, if you were important, if you had the right connections in a society that had developed surgical knowledge, they cut into your skull when things went wrong. If you were nobody, you got the herbs and a prayer and whatever comfort your family could provide while you died. This is not a small detail. It reveals that even in the ancient world, medicine was already stratified. The same community that could save a leg in Borneo could also watch a poor laborer die from a wound they knew how to treat because the knowledge or the resources or the social will wasn't extended to everyone. We want to romanticize ancient medicine as pure and communal, untouched by the inequalities of modern healthcare, but the skeletons tell a more complicated story. The rich got the holes in their heads. The poor got to hope. And sometimes even the rich didn't make it, because surgery was never safe, it was never guaranteed. It was a calculation made by people who understood that doing nothing was also a death sentence, and that cutting might be the only path forward.
So here's the question that keeps me up at night. If ancient humans were performing successful amputations 31,000 years ago and drilling skulls across multiple continents with survival rates that suggest genuine skill and practicing on animals to improve their technique, why did we ever think they were primitive? The answer is partly that we measure progress by technology, metal tools, written records, anesthesia, antiseptics. We see a bone knife and assume the mind behind it was simpler than the mind behind a scalpel. But the Borneo surgeon didn't need stainless steel. They needed knowledge. They needed steady hands. They needed a community that valued keeping the injured alive enough to support them through years of recovery. And they had all of that 24,000 years before we thought it was possible. But there's one more detail that ties this entire story together, and it's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. The modern craniotomy, the procedure neurosurgeons use today to relieve pressure on the brain, is functionally the direct descendant of trepanation. The same concept, the same goal, cut an opening in the skull to fix what's underneath. A surgical idea that predates the pyramids, the wheel, and written language. Arguably the single longest continuously reinvented medical procedure in human history. We have replaced the stone tools with titanium. We have replaced the herbal poultices with antibiotics. We have replaced the torchlight with surgical lamps and the biting stick with general anesthesia. But the idea is identical. A human being looks at another human being with a damaged head and says, "I need to open that up to save them." And then they do it, and sometimes it works. That is not a primitive impulse. That is the most advanced impulse we have. The refusal to accept that an injury is the end. The willingness to cut into the body, our own or someone else's, in the hope that what comes after the blood and the pain is survival.
You are doing this right now. Or rather, you're benefiting from it. If you've ever had stitches, a cast, antibiotics, a surgical procedure of any kind, you are the inheritor of a lineage that started in a Borneo cave 31,000 years ago. The same impulse that drove a forager to amputate a child's leg without metal tools drives a modern surgeon to separate conjoined twins or repair a heart valve or remove a tumor from a brain. We are the species that refuses to accept damage as final. We cut, we sew, we drill, we replace. We have built an entire civilization around the idea that the body can be fixed, that death from injury is negotiable, that given enough knowledge and enough courage, we can open a person up and put them back together better than we found them. And your ancestors paid for that belief in blood, in failed procedures, in young men who died on tables at Megiddo because their community thought they were worth the risk, in children who lost legs and somehow kept living, in surgeons who practiced on cows so they wouldn't kill their neighbors, in communities that carried the disabled for years because the alternative was unthinkable. The modern hospital is a cathedral built on those bones. The sterile corridor, the MRI machine, the emergency room at 3 in the morning, all of it is just the latest iteration of something ancient humans decided was worth trying long before they had any right to believe it would work. So here's what I want to know. If you were injured 31,000 years ago, say a badly broken leg in that Borneo rainforest, would you trust the ancient surgeon, knowing what you know now about their skill, their knowledge, their willingness to try? Or would you rather take your chances with modern medicine, knowing that even today, surgery is never guaranteed? And more importantly, does knowing how far back this goes change how you think about what primitive actually means? Let me know in the comments. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.